Your Royal Highness, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, my name is John Shipman, Director General and CEO of the International Institute for Strategic Studies. We are delighted to host this first IISS Riyadh Defense Forum and to present the results of work that we have conducted on defense policy and defense economics in the Middle East region. I would like to thank the Deputy Defense Minister, His Royal Highness Prince Khalid bin Salman Al Saud, and in particular, the Governor of the General Authority for Military Industries, His Excellency Ahmed bin Abdulaziz Al Huwaili, for the opportunity to bring IISS research to Riyadh. It is an honor and a privilege to present it before such an august range of delegates from so many countries and a variety of defense companies on the day before the inaugural World Defense Show. All who have come to the Kingdom for these events wish our hosts the very best of success this week. The IISS for over 60 years has generated facts, conducted analysis, and sought to strengthen sound policymaking on the problems of conflict, however caused, that may have an important military content. We are headquartered in London and have international offices in Berlin, Manama, Singapore, and Washington. For our first 30 years, we concentrated heavily on European security and the transatlantic relationship. In the last 30 years, much of our effort has been focused on the Indo-Pacific and the Middle East regional security orders. Indeed, we have worked hard to ensure a greater understanding of Middle East and Indo-Pacific strategic perspectives within the West. Today, we meet here in the Middle East to discuss the Middle East with the Middle East. This is the subject to examine here. Yet we must note that we do so at a time when the European security order has been upended. Russia has invaded the second biggest country in Europe. It has announced maximalist war aims. President Putin has written that Ukraine is not a country, but a historical part of Russia. His use of force has been brutal, and there is a strong probability that war crimes will have been committed. The most basic rule of international law has been broken, perhaps in a way not seen since Iraq invaded Kuwait. The EU and NATO have been united in their response. Germany, whose defense expenditure as a percentage of GDP was well below the agreed NATO target, announced 100 billion euros of immediate increase and that it would move at pace to invest at least 2% of GDP in defense. By next year, according to IISS data, Germany could be the third biggest spender on defense after the United States and China. Finland and Sweden are now actively considering NATO membership. Neutral Switzerland has announced that it will fully participate in the economic sanctions agreed by other Western countries. The security architecture of Europe, a core interest of Western countries, will be redesigned over the coming years. The defense economics and defense policy of Western countries shall soon be dramatically different from what they were perceived to be only 2 weeks ago. I mention all this because the security of Europe and of the Middle East is intertwined, socially, commercially, economically, diplomatically, and militarily. As today we discuss defense policy and defense economics in the Middle East, we do so against the background of the geopolitical earthquake that we are witnessing in Europe, which will have implications for this region. We hope that the assessments that we have generated can guide sound strategy on challenging issues here. The research we have conducted for this forum is vital to understand the future direction of Middle East defense policy, economics, and defense industrial development. We have concentrated on the 6 GCC states and Morocco, Algeria, Egypt, Jordan, and Israel. Our presentation today includes the highlights of a report that is 100 pages long, full of graphics and data with wide-ranging analysis. It will be available to all of you and a wider public at the end of May. The distinguished government speakers in our second plenary session have been fully briefed on it. Our first session here is in two parts: defense policy and defense economics. And allow me to invite IISS Senior Fellows Emil Hokaim and Fenella McGurty to present our key findings. Emil, the floor is yours.
Thank you, John. Good afternoon to all. Let me offer some facts that will help me frame my presentation on regional defense policy in the Middle East. Do you know that no fewer than 6 armed non-state actors in the region possess rockets and missiles that can be described as more than rudimentary or even as advanced, and have used them in operations? Do you know that 1/3 of all exported combat aircraft in the past 2 decades worldwide went to the Middle East, of which 20% went to Saudi Arabia, 70% to the UAE, and 17% to Israel? And 8 out of the 11 countries that we've studied have acquired or developed armed UAVs in recent years, and at least 5 of them are known to have used them in operations. These are some of the facts revealed by our research, and in this presentation, I will explain how these facts relate to the formulation of defense policy in the region. Before diving into this presentation, 2 caveats are in order. First, I will have to generalize, but I will focus on individual countries when it makes sense. Second, there is greater openness about defense issues in the region, but this remains less than in other parts of the world. So our research relies primarily on open source data. Consequently, our research will have gaps, but I hope that our interactions during this forum will help us fill those gaps. Now, before looking at this slide, remember that the spectrum for the design of an armed force ranges from a capability-based force to a threat-based one. Most armed forces are a combination of the two. Traditionally, MENA armed forces have been capability-based, but we observed in recent years more procurement decisions to counter specific threats, increasingly aligning the region with global trends. Now, let's turn to this pie chart. It represents the threat perceptions of the leaderships in the country we've studied. Our research did not show systematic threat assessment conducted in defense ministries or GHQs. This is different from what we observe in other parts of the world. Instead, senior leadership's views and decisions have the greatest influence on the design of armed forces. To expose this, we collected over 1,100 statements from leaders from those 11 MENA countries between 2008 and 2021. We found greater awareness and appreciation of threats, their nature and potency. This chart shows that conflict and instability, terrorism and extremism, protection of territorial integrity, and concerns about nuclear proliferation are the most important challenges identified by leaders. Interestingly, the only country that fits in each of these categories is Iran. Note that the missiles or UAV categories do not feature high, but that's only because the threat from missiles and UAVs is more recent. They got almost no mention in 2008 in comparison to 2021, where they reached the top 3 in several countries. In terms of conflict and instability, the slide shows that the overwhelming majority of armed forces engagement has been against armed non-state actors rather than other states. ISIS and Al-Qaeda and their affiliates feature prominently given the spread and potency of the extremist threats in the past 2 decades. But what is also notable is the number and intensity of military engagement with non-state actors, associated with Iran, reflecting Tehran's preference to project power through its networks, Hezbollah and Hamas in the Levant, and Ansarullah or the Houthis in Yemen. Now, let's take a step back and identify the divergences and similarities between Middle East and global defense trends. First, I will address the differences. Here are some of the major global trends. First, we see a renewed emphasis on near-peer warfare, reflected in the current tensions between the US and NATO and Russia over Ukraine, or between the US and China in Indo-Pacific. In parallel, there is a reduced attention to non-state actors as the consequence of Western fatigue with counterterrorism and counterinsurgency, but also the end of the anti-ISIS and Afghanistan interventions. Globally, there is planning for multi-domain operations and focus on technology integration, reflecting new concepts of warfare. In contrast, in the Middle East, competition takes complex forms other than direct military standoffs. Armed forces prefer to avoid direct all-out war. State rivalries can be very intense, but the prospect of conventional war remain limited because of the limitations and risk profiles of the various players. We see a continued emphasis on armed non-state actors as they remain prevalent and aggressive in Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Libya, and elsewhere. We see a prioritization of air defense and offensive air capabilities. We also see a reduced emphasis on ground capabilities because conventional ground combat is seen as less likely. Armed forces are being streamlined, and the focus is on light, easily deployable infantry and elite troops. There's also increased attention to protecting critical infrastructure. There are also important areas of convergence in defense modernization between Middle Eastern militaries and the rest of the world. First, we observe a better understanding of the complex, multi-layered ways competition in the gray zone unfolds. Countries such as Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Iran, Turkey, and others have been engaged in such competition in the past decade, where tools other than conventional military forces have often been used. Second, the development of air capabilities is primarily strategic in intent and purpose. For example, the Gulf states have sought to maintain air superiority over Iran as Tehran achieves its influence through other means. Israel's air superiority is an essential element of its campaign to contain Iran's reach. Egypt has needed air power to demonstrate it has options for the Nile River crisis or to assert its role in the Eastern Mediterranean. Air defense is a topic that will be developed in a second. Lastly, competition in the cyber domain is now intense. Stuxnet in 2010 and Shamoon in 2012 were pivotal moments in raising cyber awareness. Cyber is now addressed and coordinated at the highest level of government in the region. The emphasis on air defense is primarily driven by the rise of airborne attacks, which we show on this map. The date on this map indicates the date of the first known such attack. As the coloring shows, the majority of the 11 countries we've looked at have had less than 10 incidents. However, we have counted between 10 and 50 incidents in the UAE and considerably more than 50 for both Saudi Arabia and Israel. The three sets of actors that have used air-to-ground, ground-to-ground, ground-to-sea, and air-to-sea attacks on a regular basis outside the context of conventional war have been extremist groups such as Al-Qaeda and ISIS, militias aligned with Iran, and Iran itself. It is noteworthy that the most capable and technologically sophisticated militias are those benefiting from state sponsorship, in this case, groups supported by Iran. Extremist groups such as Al-Qaeda and ISIS have deployed rockets, missiles, and UAVs, but of considerably inferior quality and in much smaller quantities. This level of attacks has been a driver for Saudi, Emirati, and Israeli defense acquisition. Other countries, concerned that they too might come under attack, have also shown interest. The policy response to airborne attacks has been threefold: growing interest in ground-based air defense, investment in aircraft, and investment in UAVs. In the past 2 decades, the Gulf states have prioritized the purchase or upgrading of air defense systems. This map shows which country deploys ground-based air defenses and the origin of these systems. As you can see, the US is currently the leading provider of ballistic missile defense systems, which has been the main focus of the Gulf states. In contrast, there is a lack of modern anti-rocket systems as well as anti-cruise missile and anti-UAV air defense. The US, the preferred provider, has not always been able to provide a solution, so countries are starting to look elsewhere. 2 notable examples: the UAE decision to buy Russian Pantsir systems in 2000, and the more recent decision to buy the South Korean Changong-2 system. Because of its long-standing exposure to such attacks, Israel has been at the forefront, developing its own layered systems, having had the advantage of access to US technology. This experience is being examined across the region. It is important to note that the procurement of these systems in the Middle East is more about the protection of national sovereignty, population, and infrastructure than it is about deterrence, which is somewhat different than elsewhere. The second part of this response is the modernization of air forces in the region. This graph shows the exports of new aircraft worldwide in the past 2 decades. You can see how significant MENA acquisitions, which are shown in blue, have been in the past 2 decades. Approximately 1/3 of the total exports. Fenella will talk a bit longer about aircraft procurement. This development is both about the defense and deterrence, but also about the ability to project power to attack, preempt, and punish. In the 90s and 2000s, only the Israeli Air Force conducted offensive operations. In the past decade, however, several other regional militaries, air forces, have become active in Libya, Yemen, Syria, and elsewhere. Procurement of UAVs has been the third element of the response. Armed UAVs are seen as an essential component of a modern arsenal and a demonstration of technological capability. Because they are easier to procure and deploy and are versatile, they allow for defense modernization without the need for a major reorganization of the force. Arsenals are growing rapidly, but access to UAVs is limited by the NTCR regime and political constraints. This too will be detailed later. I want to put all this procurement in context. Over the years, and particularly in the Gulf states, the security guarantee has been provided by Western powers, countries with sophisticated defense industrial bases. Continuing to secure these guarantees has required active alliance management on the part of the MENA states. Our research shows that defense diplomacy and purchases of high-value assets are key ways MENA states secure and solidify strategic relationships that have direct as well as indirect security, political, and economic benefits. The more complex and long-lasting a weapon system is, the more amplified and profound the relationship between buyer and seller tends to be. Finding the right provider is therefore just as much a political strategic exercise as it is a technical procurement decision. Here's a way to illustrate this. It is no surprise that 72% of the fighter aircraft in current MENA stocks comes from the US, with France a distant second at 13%, Russia at 9%, and the UK at 6%. In contrast to combat aircraft, naval systems are generally seen as less central in sustaining strategic relationships. It is therefore easier for Middle Eastern countries to look for less sophisticated, value-for-money systems from a wider base of providers and establish differentiated relationships. Looking at attack submarines, frigates, amphibious ships, and corvettes in service, France leads with 24% of the total stock, followed by Germany at 19% and the US at 17%. 10 countries are current suppliers of such capabilities, as opposed to 4 in the case of combat aircraft. Our research also shows that MENA states place high value on defense partnership with extra-regional militaries. Interviews suggest that in 9 out of the 11 countries we studied, defense partnerships and interoperability are cited as key objectives of defense policy and defense procurement. They are a way to cultivate and engage extra-regional partners through military exchanges, exercises, and training. This explains the numerous military-to-military interactions between the US, UK, and France on the one hand, and most of the 11 MENA countries on the other. In addition, we have seen in recent years a notable increase in defense minilaterals, such as the formation of the informal Eastern Mediterranean grouping of France, Greece, Egypt, Cyprus, Israel, and the UAE. These minilaterals are expressed through high-level political exchanges, as well as bilateral defense agreements, joint exercises, and training. In this final slide, we want to show the complexity of defense modernization decision-making in the MENA region. As you can see, countries like Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Israel, or the UAE have many more drivers than others. Importantly, defense modernization is not just about defense. It is also about regional standing, strategic relationships, and economic ambitions. Some drivers are more important than others. In our research, we identified 5 types of defense modernization drivers. In blue, we show that new leadership has an impact. In 5 countries, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Oman, Algeria, and Qatar, new leaders have come to power in the past decade, and their ideas are shaping the defense evolution of their countries. In purple, we look at strategic drivers. Let's take the UAE, for example. What started as a small force deployed in the Balkans or Afghanistan has turned into a significant expeditionary capability. What started as alliance management turned into projection of state interest. Nevertheless, alliance management remains an important driver for the UAE. It has privileged relationships with the US and France and is doing a lot to maintain them, buying high-end weapon systems and participating in many joint exercises. At the same time, the UAE is engaging in strategic diversification to respond to the perception of US retrenchment. Therefore, new powers, notably China, Russia, and India, deserve more attention, and this translates into defense relations. We also look at regional drivers. Jordan, for instance, has focused on protecting its borders during the campaign against ISIS. For Egypt, the Nile River crisis, the growing importance of the Red Sea, and competition in the Eastern Mediterranean are major drivers of defense modernization. Particular security events can also influence this decision-making. The 2019 attacks against Saudi Aramco facilities have illustrated the Saudi need to patch up vulnerabilities and acquire defense systems owned and operated locally. Finally, there are economic and industrial logics at play. Saudi Arabia and the UAE have broad modernizing agendas, and their respective economic visions view the defense sectors as pathway to industrialization and economic diversification. So to conclude, for long, we saw Middle Eastern militaries as static, reluctant to evolve. A careful study of the defense sectors in the region shows a more nuanced picture. Wholesale defense modernization remains highly unlikely, but the threat landscape is better understood and acknowledged. The more focused and gradual approach that I just detailed appears to be politically more palatable and practically more realistic. Thank you for your attention.
Emile, thank you very much indeed for that. May I now invite our Senior Fellow for Defense Economics, Fenella McGurty, to address the defense economics element of our research.
Thank you, Emile, and thank you, John. Good afternoon, everybody. So our next part of the study looked at the defense economics, industrial development, emerging tech procurement trends in the region. So quite a lot to get through, and we also placed them in a global context. A few key themes stood out. The first is that while the region accounts for 10% of global defense expenditure, it has in recent years been the destination for up to 25% of defense exports. So clearly a crucial export market that is now increasingly seeking to develop indigenous capabilities. A roadblock to this development is the second theme, that regional investment in R&D is too low, less than 1% of defense budgets. Without significant increases, regional defense industrial goals aren't really possible. Finally, these increases will only be effective if they are accompanied by sustained investment in the defense industrial base and by a formalized, transparent industrial policy, as I will discuss later. But for now, let's start with the economics. Clearly, the contraction in global GDP was far more severe and more globally spread than in 2009. Middle Eastern economies outperformed the world trend after the financial crisis, but was more severely affected by the pandemic. Fiscal conditions were already constrained in the region coming into the crisis. So the scale of the economic contraction, the initial recovery is now known, but the longer-term shape of the recovery isn't. And several factors are impacting this. Beyond the immediate economic impact, per capita GDP levels in the region are estimated to have declined by 5.3% in 2020, and there's been limited recovery ever since. And this is a global trend as well. So that's going to deepen regional inequality, disrupt stability, and eventually become a security issue. Globally, inflation rates have spiked, fueled by increased energy costs, ongoing supply chain disruptions, and that's now been exacerbated by Russia's invasion of the Ukraine and continuing to hinder the global recovery going forward. As governments move to increase interest rates to try and calm inflation, that will increase the cost of borrowing at a time when fiscal deficits are at record levels. That's going to create pressure on public spending and therefore defense budgets. Within defense budgets themselves, you also have higher operating costs, wage pressures, so that has the potential to crowd out R&D or investment in emerging technologies. So that's internal and external pressure on defense spending. If we look at defense spending trends over the last 12 years or so, there are clear regional divergences. The US presents the only negative figure here, and that's really due to the distortion of OCO spending, overseas contingency operations funding, between 2008 and 2011. So the difference between 08 spending and 21 is minus 13% for North America. We have seen some growth in the US defense budget in recent years, bigger increases in 2018 and 2020, but the higher rate of inflation, a drop in operations and construction spending, saw a real contraction of 6% in the US defense budget last year. And in fact, higher rates of inflation have resulted in real spending contractions in all regions bar Asia and Europe in 2021. Asian defense budgets have proved remarkably resilient throughout the pandemic and any other economic challenges. They've maintained a sustained rate of growth since 2011. Increases have been driven by emerging markets like China, obviously, which accounts for 43% of regional spending. But there's also been strong growth evident in more mature markets, so South Korea, Australia, and more recently, Japan. Last year also saw the 7th consecutive year of growth in Europe. Regional spending increased by 4.8% in real terms, the fastest rate globally. Germany's announcement last week that spending would be bolstered by a 100 billion euro special budget, immediate commitment, ongoing commitment to reaching 2% of GDP. That's going to spur further growth. If Germany does reach the 2% of GDP target this year, it would reach about $90 billion, by far the largest budget in Europe, the third largest budget globally, as John mentioned. The increase alone, around $30 billion, is close to what Italy spends on defense each year. This and other subsequent uplifts that have been announced by France, Poland, Austria, Romania, that would also mean for the second year in a row, Europe's the fastest growing region in terms of defense spending. A key driver of this European growth has been and will continue to be Russian actions. Russian spending, even though it has fallen back in real terms in recent years, and certainly in US dollar terms, is still 40% higher than 2008 levels, far higher in PPP terms. If there's any interest in that, we can discuss it in the Q&A. But for now, let's move on to the Middle East. Regional defense spending has effectively been flat in nominal terms in recent years, around $170 billion. But with rates of inflation averaging near 7% annually, we have seen real terms cuts of around 3.6% annually. Nevertheless, regional spending is still 42% higher than it was in 2008 in real terms. So let's look at the Middle East spending trend in more detail. So because of the dominance of GCC expenditure in the region, defense budget movements track with a slight lag movements in the oil price rather than economic growth. That creates an incredibly volatile trend in Middle East defense expenditure. So when oil prices drop, as they did between 2014 and 2016, defense budgets came under pressure. Countries were initially able to increase borrowing, utilize extensive fiscal reserves in the region, and shored up defense spending, or at least ring-fenced it. But eventually, defense budgets cuts became unavoidable. Nations pursued fiscal consolidation, moved towards more of a sustainment phase. Fiscal support was effective in countering the economic hardship caused by the pandemic, but it did come at a further cost to government balance sheets. Fiscal deficits have extended, government debt levels have risen. They've reached 64% in 2021, up from 57% of GDP in 2019. That level doesn't sound that large, certainly not by global standards. But if you consider that interest rates may increase, that will increasingly become unaffordable and create that pressure. Balancing this is the 2022 oil price projection. Currently averaging $80 over the year. Obviously, at the moment, it's a lot higher, $80 a barrel. So that's sufficient to balance the defense budgets of most countries in the region, certainly the largest spenders. Several countries have brought down their fiscal break-even oil price, and either through fiscal consolidation or diversifying revenues. So there has been a concerted effort to reduce the reliance on the oil price within fiscal budgets. So as such, with strategic drivers, modernization requirements remaining in place, the easing of economic and fiscal constraints should enable spending to at least stabilize. Inflation will continue to be an issue, as it will globally, but generally economic fundamentals are strengthening because of that. The next few graphics look at regional spending in comparison to global metrics. Here I've shown defense budgets as a proportion of total government spending and as a proportion of GDP. It's effectively double in the region on both metrics, 12 to 6% on government spending, 4 to 6% with regards to GDP. The already high proportion of government spending allocated to defense in the region dramatically increased in 2013 and continued to increase when oil prices were struggling. So that shows that initially defense was ring-fenced until we have that drop in 2018. Globally, the trend is completely different. Defense fell as a proportion of government spending in 2010, and it remained steady at this lower level, even when growth to defense budgets resumed globally. Since 2013, defense spending has been relatively stable as a proportion of GDP in the region, but it varies across different countries. So Saudi Arabia, Oman, Kuwait, Algeria consistently spend in excess of 5-6%. Meanwhile, Egypt, Bahrain, Lebanon spend between 2 and 4%. But generally, the region is still well above global averages. So how are countries spending this money? This graphic shows the breakdown of spending between personnel, operational spending, and investment covering procurement and R&D. Clearly, there are differences between the Middle East regional split and the global breakdown, and that's because globally defense investment was really suffered in the wake of the financial crisis, which meant that more recently, global investment focus has really been bolstered. Countries like Australia, Poland, they've established targets for levels of equipment spending within the budget. Generally, they've been achieved, and that's enabled the investment proportion of global spending to increase. Several of the biggest global spenders have also worked to restructure defense spending. They've tried to reduce personnel costs, streamline operations, sustainment, refocus on procurement and R&D, and address any capability gaps that emerged when cuts came in. Looking at the Middle East, our data indicates that investment was bolstered towards the middle of the last decade. But in more recent years, budgetary pressures have caused investment to fall back somewhat. This spending was squeezed out by the need to maintain the more dominant personnel proportion, but also by increased operational expenditure as the region entered more regional engagements, like, say, Yemen, for instance. I should point out that we do have issues with transparency here. At the top defense budget level, there has been some improvements in transparency in recent years. For example, Saudi Arabia has determined the split between defense and security spending in recent years, but transparency around the functional breakdown of defense spending is quite hard to find. So you can only determine figures based on available data or estimates for known programs. We just don't have the granularity to determine the split between R&D and procurement. But the traditional reliance on foreign purchases would imply that that procurement takes up the majority of this investment portion. We do know that national R&D budgets generally remain low and vary between 0.1 and 0.7% of GDP, and that's R&D for all sectors, not just defense. By contrast, if you look at Israel, their R&D investment is higher, sort of 1.35% of GDP, and roughly 1/3 is military-oriented. So that's building on strong synergies between civilian and military research sectors. We can really infer, therefore, that defense R&D is low and it will need to increase significantly to achieve localization and domestic capability development goals. So how does the region compare to others globally? This final chart, looking at the metrics, shows everything in a global context, using those NATO metrics as a sort of guide to see whether the defense budget is achieved in 2% of GDP or 20% of the budget goes to investment. I think it's really stark how countries are orienting their defense budget. China, Russia, and the US spending much higher proportions of their budget on investment compared to Europe and Asia, certainly compared to Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa. That reorientation I mentioned before really comes through here. Europe and the global average is in the top right quadrant. So in 2021, 9 of the countries in NATO reached the 2% of GDP target, but 22 of the 30 members reached the 20% threshold. In terms of spending as a proportion of GDP, you can clearly see the extent to which the Middle East is an outlier. It's well beyond other regions, but it's somewhat lower in terms of how much of the defense budget is dedicated to investment. It's still within reach of the 20% recommendation that exists for NATO countries, implying it's nearing the level that is sufficient to support a defense industrial base. This does mask regional variations, cyclical investment spending, which itself is a trend that prohibits the sustainment of a defense industrial base. It's also worth mentioning that if you were to create this chart back in 2014-15, it would look quite different because of the peak of recapitalization efforts then. Off-budget funding would also impact this chart, but again, we have issues of transparency. So this is the sort of known figure of 2021. In terms of defense industrial development, countries are at different stages in developing formal industrial policy. For the defense sector, there's varying degrees of focus on localization, industrial participation, and technology transfer. Offset policies, when they are published, are predominantly left to form the core basis of defense industrial development, and that does create issues. It does mean that any capability creation is subject to defense procurement cycles. It means fiscal limitations are based on offset multipliers, the willingness of transfer of technology from foreign partners, and the focus on areas that may not be in the best interests of long-term sustainable defense industrial base. The array of other long-standing and equally lucrative engineering and manufacturing sectors creates a challenge for defense, so hydrocarbon extraction, has that need for high-quality equipment, skilled personnel, creating a bit of competition, which challenges development further. Publicly slating areas for localized capabilities has improved transparency, helping partner governments and industry better to understand how to approach the potential government customer. Key example here is Saudi Arabia's announcement of 7 key areas for R&D investment to be achieved by 2030 as the country looks to achieve 50% localization of defense procurement by the end of 2030. Consolidation of defense industrial assets is also evident in the region. We've seen in the UAE coordination of broader government policy with that of offset strategy, and that means that government investment is leveraged into industrial and macroeconomic development. Saudi Arabia is also utilizing this approach through the industrial participation policy. In terms of the control or the makeup of industry, state-based control is the norm within the region, and we find that partial privatization could help encourage increased investment in organizations that have good prospects for the defense sector. Intellectual property could be maintained through market controls or maintaining a golden share. As force modernization continues to advance rapidly in the region, foreign governments will also have to increasingly recognize the need to allow countries to develop or manufacture equipment under license if they wish to retain their influence. If they fail to do so, we've seen China and Turkey rapidly moving to fill the vacuum. So on to emerging technologies. Our data indicates that the main defense applications of EDTs across the region are in autonomous and semi-autonomous military platforms, enhanced situational awareness, electromagnetic spectrum capabilities, directed energy, missile defense, and counter-UAV systems. Regional actors are increasingly interested in developing these technologies, both as part of foreign-oriented defense procurement, but also a few actors are domestically developing them too. The 7 priority areas mentioned earlier for defense R&D by Saudi Arabia include directed energy, electromagnetic weapons, cybersecurity, and AI. The UAE has several subsidiaries focused on AI, directed energy, quantum computing, autonomous robotics, cryptography, advanced materials, and cybersecurity. A main driver of this effort towards the adoption of EDTs in defense is a focus on the accelerated adoption. So it's not just the superiority, it's the speed with which this technology can be adopted into next-generation military platforms. It needs to generate mass, be rapidly tested and deployed in open conflicts across the region. Another driver is a desire to compensate for smaller armed forces through technology and software-defined solutions, autonomous capability and leveraging data to shorten decision-making, targeting cycles. That's seen as critical force multipliers. Nevertheless, we do have structural and technological challenges that's limiting this pace of adoption. The comparatively low national R&D budgets, as we mentioned, but there are countries seeking to address this. Saudi Arabia has announced plans to increase R&D spending from 0.2% of the budget to 4% by 2030, and is intending to invest 10 billion in the defense industry and 10 billion in defense R&D. That investment will be key to reaching localization goals, but I would again appeal for greater transparency so that it's possible to determine how these goals are progressing. Beyond budgets, the further challenge is that defense R&D programs continue to rely on joint ventures, partnerships with foreign tech companies, the global scarcity of human skilled resources, the global competition for these competencies, and the dependency on attracting foreign tech talent is another issue. Efforts to develop domestic skills are obviously ongoing, but it's an intergenerational effort. It takes time, and the first results will take time to come through, certainly in these newer domains. In the study, we looked at a few EDT profiles, and I'll just share with you our AI findings, but there is also a cyber profile and a space profile. So there is evidence of an acceleration in the development and adoption of AI applications across the region. All regional actors have adopted AI strategies, but only 2 specifically include defense applications among the priority areas, and only 4 have publicly known ongoing R&D projects related to AI and autonomy. As a result, there's a greater disparity between the maturity of AI governance structures as perhaps there is in other sectors. Israel is the leader in the development and integration of AI technologies in defense, and it has this advantage because of the capacity to leverage integration of several EDTs in AI and military applications. UAE and Saudi Arabia, the region's two other most advanced countries in this region, the past 4 years has been marked by a consolidation of their defense industrial base. There's a more prominent component of R&D than in the past, and there's new organizations and structures and promises of increases in R&D budgets. So we should start to see these two regional actors play a greater role in this domain too. So based on our research and data, so 4 main trends will shape the integration of EDTs and their application in defense across the region. The first is that progress will continue to depend on relations with foreign companies, which presents interoperability, political, technological challenges. Defense R&D sector remains dominated by public entities that are seeking partnerships with foreign big tech, large defense contracts, rather than engaging perhaps with startups, SMEs, and academia, although this is starting to shift. The second trend relates to the persistence and differences in technological capacity across the region because of this adoption of EDTs. That may accelerate regional conflicts, but because of that divergence in technological capacity, it's not going to provide enduring shifts in the balance of military power. Thirdly, offset contracts and defense joint ventures will increasingly include EDTs in technology transfer, in addition to the localization of production as part of counter-trade. A final point is that there is an increasing but selective presence of newer defense partners on the regional market in these domains. Israel has emerged lately in the region as relations have begun to normalize. China has become a primary regional supplier of armed autonomous aerial systems and other conventional capabilities for 9 of the MENA states. We will be hosting a thought leadership session tomorrow. My colleague Simona Soare will be talking on this topic in greater detail, so if you can make that first thought leadership session at the WDS, I encourage you to come down. So the next part of the presentation looks at defense procurement. So as Emil mentioned, over the past 2 decades, the region has received 1/3 of new-build tactical combat aircraft exports. The F-16 has been the most popular choice during this time, accounting for over 1/3 of all deliveries in the region. And of the 11 countries that we focused on in this study, 8 are either receiving or are contracted to receive new combat aircraft in the coming years. This chart only shows aircraft in service, not those on order, so it will shift over time as deliveries are made. Qatar's combat aircraft fleet is being transformed into one of the most modern in the region, 96 aircraft sourced from 3 different nations. Integrating and operating that will be a significant challenge. But generally, as well as acquiring new aircraft, we have seen countries in the region moving to upgrade existing aircraft towards more modern standards, and so it's still a key area of investment in the region. So exploiting a gap created by US unwillingness to export and indeed MTCR regulations, China has since the early 2010s exported armed UAVs into a number of countries in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. Turkey has also enjoyed export success in these regions. Israel has long operated its own UAV models, likely including armed versions, but has only exported unarmed versions to date. Israel is the only country in the Middle East that has exported armed UAVs with deliveries to Algeria, but the key player here is China. A 2017 $65 billion deal between China and Saudi Arabia reportedly included the establishment of a UAV factory in Kingdom. So it's unclear how much progress has been made, but it does show how important China is as a regional player, and also the potential as an industrial partner, showing more willingness for technology transfer and industrial production. Moving on to land systems. So across the world, main battle tank numbers have declined, in part due to so-called peace dividend following the end of the Cold War, but also because of the increasing cost of one-for-one replacement. For the most part, this has been the same in the region. 2 largest operators, Egypt and Israel, they've retired hundreds of legacy platforms in recent years. Egypt's local assembly of M1 Abrams has partially offset this, but there is still an overall fall in numbers. Israel has also retired hundreds of legacy tanks, reorienting its fleet around the more modern Merkava 3 and 4 models. To look at modernization another way, we've shown MBT fleets here according to capability category, as determined by the Institute, from obsolescent to modern plus. Today, tanks of US origin make up 47% of those we class as having modern or modern plus capability, but Russian and Soviet origin tanks comprise 25% of the total, but 16% of modern totals. So that implies that it has a declining market share, and we are starting to see the region engage with other partners. European origin tanks, for instance, have increased their market share. So only Morocco currently operates Chinese tanks, but that's notable because it's the first Chinese MBT export to the region since the sales to Iraq and Iran in the 1980s. Looking at the maritime sector, so whilst the most significant investment has gone towards combat aircraft, air defense systems, the past decade has also seen a concerted effort to recapitalize naval capabilities. Of the 71 frigates and corvettes currently in service with navies in the region, 41% were built after 2009. Based on current contracts, more frigates and corvettes will be built over the rest of this decade than were built during the 80s, 90s, and 2000s combined. The growing preference over time towards these larger vessels and away from smaller mission craft indicates a desire to operate further from shore, as well as to accommodate changes in platform technologies. So to sum up investment in land, investment has lagged relative to the significant investment in air and, to a lesser extent, naval capabilities over the last decade. Modernization and sustainment efforts are ongoing. Defense procurement decisions will continue, and they'll be shaped by alliance management considerations, threat space calculations, and power projection requirements. In conclusion, with the strengthening economic fundamentals, the Middle East is gradually emerging from quite a challenging period. A focus on targeted procurement, domestic industrial development, and export success is also the focus. The greater clarity of national R&D priorities among regional leaders is encouraging, countries recognizing the emergence of EDTs and the measures needed to contend with and develop these capabilities onshore. In response to the evolving threat environment and technological advances, we're seeing that slow evolution from legacy capabilities-based forces towards more modern threats-based in several Middle Eastern countries. Thank you for your time today. I'll now hand the floor back to John. Thanks.
Thank you. Fenella, thank you very much indeed. We now turn to the question and answer period. I'll take 4 or 5 in the first round before coming back to the panel. A technological reminder, which is that if you take your badge out of the back of its plastic folder and insert it beside your microphone and press the button, a green light will come on. That does not mean that your microphone is on. It only means that you're in my queue. I alone can turn your microphone on, but also I alone can turn it off. I look forward to the first 4 or 5 questions, and the first comes from Tom Beckett.
Yes, it's a question for Fenella. Looking at the region, there seem to be 3 dominating countries that are trying to develop their industrial base. Israel, already fairly well developed, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. The latter 2 both started slightly later, and I wouldn't mind if you could just give us an assessment of how it's going. You've mentioned some of the factors that inhibit that defense industrialization, the localization, but if you could just give us an expression of how it's going and whether they'll meet some of the targets with some of the challenges that they face.
Thanks very much. And next was Bastian Giegrick.
John, thank you very much, and thank you, Emil and Fenella. My question is in a related area, primarily for Fenella as well. Fenella, when you spoke about defense in industrialization developments and localization targets, you had several clear messages. One of them was that unless countries in the region spent more on defense R&D, they were unlikely to meet their goals and their targets. But then you also suggested that countries need to find their own ways of bringing the different factors into balance. And you mentioned a couple of them, access to talent and so on. So I was just wondering whether you could expand on that a little bit to say a bit more what countries should be focusing on as they find their own path to move on all of these factors, move forward on all of these factors. So it's a question related to the one that Thomas asked. Thank you.
Thanks. And from Japan, Yuka Koshino.
Thank you. I also have quick two questions for Fenella. First, you mentioned the impact of COVID-19 and price pressures and the acceleration of inflation driven from the war in Ukraine. But could you elaborate more on, the impact of those on the government spending side, but could you elaborate more on how these inflations will impact the defense contractors themselves? And then a second question, you mentioned that the region is looking for newer defense partners for emerging disruptive technologies. What do you think the priorities for these cooperation partners would be? Would it be on the willingness of technology transfer? Thank you.
Thank you. And from Bahrain, Hassan Al-Hassan.
Thank you, John. My question is addressed to Emil. Emil, you mentioned alliance management as a key driver of defense modernization and defense procurement in the region. There's been a growing perceptual gap, I think, between regional countries, including in the Gulf, and their Western partners on issues of core strategic interest. Iran for the Gulf states, increasingly Russia and European security for the Western partners. Do you see that having an effect on defense procurement and modernization going forward, or do modernization and procurement tell a different story? Thank you.
Thanks very much. I'll come back to the floor in a moment for another 3 questions, but let's start with Fenella for the number that were asked of you, and then Emil. Fenella.
Thank you. So in terms of UAE and Saudi Arabia, how's it going on the defense industrial policy development? Obviously, the last few years there's been increasing focus and increasing movements on these industrial policies. Arguably, the Saudi Arabia policy started a lot longer ago, but there are differences in the two approaches. Perhaps the UAE's was more targeted, Saudi Arabia's more broad. And now what we're seeing is there's a slight divergence in these approaches, but also the countries are also looking at increasing engagement with international partners. So we've seen both countries now move to 100% foreign ownership of entities in country, which then encourages that technology transfer and means companies are more comfortable with doing this. I think the UAE's movement to increase the number of sectors that are able to sort of offset multipliers, moving towards those newer technologies, EDTs, energy security as well. So the ability for companies to engage in those markets as well as just defense in order to complete offset obligations is a key kind of advantage there. The Saudi Arabian approach to looking at more improving human capital and education and those aspects is encouraging too. But I think it's also a good sign that the two countries are starting to engage more together. We saw SAMI and the NIMA deal last year. So they recognize each other's goals, and it's encouraging that both can work together to sort of achieve them. And on Bastian's point, how do you balance those different factors and challenges? I think as these countries look to evolve these industrial policies and incorporate other aspects, and if they do manage to increase that R&D component, that will help bolster those industrial efforts. I think these countries have sort of recognized that need, but R&D spending is still really low elsewhere. So that's going to create challenges for kind of interoperability if there are more foreign actors in the region. So if you have one country that is helping with infrastructure and another company engaged on the capabilities side, the interoperability issue comes in. And until countries move towards that indigenous development stage, increasing R&D budgets, they won't be able to then take those technologies on board and develop them indigenously. And that also creates the issue that if there is that foreign engagement, these countries can become kind of caught between regional global geopolitics. So depending on the partners that are chosen, it can create difficulties as well.
You have to be fair to Yuka Koshino over there.
So inflation. COVID-19 obviously did create price pressures, and we're starting to see inflation really spike across the region. And that did happen in the wake of the financial crisis as well, but it was a lot more short-lived. So countries were able to withstand that spike in inflation. This is looking to be a lot more protracted, and the fact that with Russian actions, energy prices are now increasing again, the cost of living starts to increase, and that squeezes the budget from outside, and total public spending starts to feel the pressure as well. Within the defence budget, we are looking at the different components, and ultimately, it's all inputs begin to be more expensive. So any component of the defence budget, so personnel gets more expensive because of wage increases, operations more expensive because of fuel and sustainment costs, procurement more expensive because of raw materials. We saw a 25% uplift in the cost of metal over the last few years, and that's actually really impacted Russian defense industry as well, and it's starting to impact sort of shipbuilding and those components too. So it's the protracted nature of inflation that's really the worry going forward. New defense partners, yes, the priorities on and the willingness for technology transfer. I think the emergence of China in the region and the establishment of in-country development, certainly in unmanned systems, is a real indication that the country is perhaps more open and more willing for that aspect. But I think, I mean, it's been a feature of defence industrial policy for a few years now. Companies looking to engage in the region are aware of it, and are now looking to engage a bit more in terms of how they can look into these policies and make sure that they bring their best approach and their best contract when it's opened out to them. And I think the willingness for technology transfer is obviously crucial, but it's also the willingness to engage in other aspects of the economy and an understanding of which sectors these countries are hoping to develop as well. So not just defence, you have to look beyond defence, so energy security, new materials, those kind of areas too. So it's a kind of a combination of all, and I think companies are starting to engage with that, or they have been for the last few years. It does create difficulties and barriers, but I think that's recognised on the other side, and we've started to see an opening up and a way of making offset policy a bit more flexible.
Thanks very much. Emil Hokaim.
Yes, thank you. So what is the impact on defense policy and procurement of policy, sometimes strategic divergence between extra-regional partners of the region and regional partners? It's a tough question. Countries in the region are increasingly opportunistic. They have access to many more weapon systems. They have improving relations with suppliers. We saw, for instance, the recent UAE purchase of the South Korean defense system. That's quite notable. At times, it's because the traditional providers don't have a solution, or because there are other obstacles. At times, it is, and we'll see, this is a big question mark. It could. Let's look at the fate, for instance, of the UAE plan to buy the F-35 from the US. This could be an interesting indicator of whether there are procurement impacts to policy differences, if indeed it's driven by that. At the same time, I would remind people that the UAE has just bought French Rafale systems, solidifying a relationship that has been on since the 90s. So I don't think at the moment we see a departure from traditional alliances which are delivering. I think the investment in defense relations, defense diplomacy is still strong, and serves at times to moderate any political difference that exists. I think on the longer term, however, and that's certainly the preference in a number of Western capitals, is that the region equipped itself enough so that it doesn't necessarily rely on Western capabilities. And we see some of that happening, in terms of ISR, UAVs, missile defense, and so on. So that would be an evolution actually welcomed by those providing the security guarantee.
Thank you very much. We've got another group of 4, and then we'll come back to the panel and conclude this plenary session. James Hackett first.
John, thanks. Question to Emil. I mean, a couple of references, of course, to the major war that's taking place in Ukraine at the moment. Based on the presentation that you laid out and the slides of the systems and the policy priorities that states are pursuing, what capability lessons, even though it's early days, do you think they may be drawing from Russia's war in Ukraine? And another one, if I may, to Fenella. One of your slides indicated the connection between oil prices and defense spending in a region. As we're currently seeing an increase in oil prices and that may persist in the short to medium term, are you anticipating similar increases in regional defense budgets? Thank you.
Thank you. And Douglas Barry.
It's a question in part to Emil and in part to Fenella. Iran needs to recapitalize a range of systems. Emil, I wondered what your thinking was in terms of priorities. Fenella, what do you think Tehran's capacity is to actually fund some of its ambitions, and where might it look to fulfill these?
Thank you. That's a very topical subject even these days. Nick Childs.
Thank you, John. The waters of this region are perhaps among the strategically most significant, and also they include some of the most important maritime choke points. Arguably, these waters have also been amongst the most contested down the years, and yet regional naval investments, with perhaps 1 or 2 exceptions, have perhaps been less than they might be expected in terms of all that I've just laid out. So I think particularly to Emil, is that the case, do you think? And if so, why? And Fenella talked about perhaps an increase in capitalization of naval forces going forward. What's behind that? Thank you very much.
Thanks. And finally, General Sir Tom Beckett gets a second crack.
Yes, it's a question probably both for Fenella and Emil. And we've spoken about countries that may replace those who are unwilling to do technology transfer. And the one that's been mentioned most is China. But as far as I can tell, China's market share is pretty low. It's mainly in the UAV space, and we've got Morocco with Chinese tanks. How competitive is it? And an assessment of how competitive could it be?
Thanks very much. Well, that's a rich menu. I'll go back again first to Fenella and then to Emil. 2.5 minutes each. So Fenella, give it a go.
Thank you. So to James' question regarding the spike in oil prices, obviously that does alleviate fiscal pressure, but I don't think we'll get that knee-jerk reaction that perhaps we did in the past. I think there's been a more concerted effort towards more sustainable fiscal policy. So when oil prices increase, because they have been so volatile in the past, I think countries will move to shore up fiscal reserves or use it in order to sort of balance spending a bit more. I don't think there will be spikes caused by it. It will facilitate growth and may mean that we don't have a real times decline. But in terms of a surge, I think unless oil prices are maintained at this level for a period of years, it doesn't, because of that lag that we saw between oil prices and the defense budget, it will only then translate into an increase. That said, with the Russian actions in Ukraine, and we have seen the spike in energy prices, depending on how long that crisis or that invasion and conflict continues, then if oil prices then do stay at that high level, it does facilitate it. But on the flip side, apologies, I'm talking, but the flip side is that it does create security issues too. So even though you have the economic impetus to increase spending, you also have difficulties with food supplies and other cost of living increases and the spike of inflation. So it's a bit of a balancing act. Should I move on to the Iran question then?
Yeah.
So the recapitalization efforts, Iranian inflation has reached 40%. The currency has not really strengthened or kept its value against foreign currencies. So that creates huge pressure for these recapitalization efforts in a country where domestic development has been hindered by the lack of foreign engagement that has been able to continue. So that's going to create a significant challenge for Iranian recapitalization efforts. In terms of the partners, I think a continuation of previous engagements is likely, seeing as the progress of normalizing relations and a move back to the agreements with the West haven't really progressed. Again, though, because of currency issues and inflation and domestic issues in terms of consumption and what's going on there, that's still a difficult, a conflicting priority for public spending. So even if there are recapitalization efforts, it's whether the country is able to fund them. And in terms of the regional naval investment, so that graphic showed that there was increased investment in frigates and corvettes, and far more than over the last 3 decades. And I think that was a readdressment of those capabilities. We did also find in the study that there were a few gaps in naval capabilities, not least mine countermeasure vessels. So where countries may need this capability, I think because the focus has been on air systems, air defense, we're now starting to see that refocus on naval systems, but it's kind of starting at this sort of frigates and corvettes level, and then we'll continue to the more targeted capability vessels.
Thanks very much. Emil Hokaim.
Thank you. Certainly, the Middle East is watching the war in Ukraine with great interest. Not because this is the kind of the model of war that is expected in the region, but particularly because of the interest in the performance of various systems deployed on that battlefield. I think there is great interest in seeing how UAVs performed. We saw in the past decade UAVs used across the region and in the near abroad, such as the Nagorno-Karabakh. So there is actually an interest now in seeing how UAVs perform on a battlefield in which a major military power operates. There's also an interest in seeing how air defense are deployed and how performing they are on that battlefield. It's very early to make a judgment on that. To be honest, the fact, for instance, that the Ukrainian Air Force still is able to operate in the air and still has air defenses is something that has surprised some analysts because of the assumption that these would be taken out early on. But that's perhaps because of a specific Russian decision in terms of how it pursues that war. We see UAVs as significant, but UAVs alone are not an answer. It depends on how much air defense they're facing. We have the examples of Libya and elsewhere where it's the combination that works, not one system in isolation. In terms of Iran rebuilding its defense sector, Fenella addressed the issue of resources. Let me address what the probable needs are and then link that to what access Iran would have to capabilities. I think the main needs that Iran will have are on air defense, air force, and missiles. The only 2 providers out there are probably Russia and China. I think for the foreseeable future, Russia, because of its own investment in the war in Ukraine, is unlikely to be a prime exporter because it probably will prioritize its own needs. So China is certainly a big player on that. China has quite a lot to offer on this front, but it really comes down to a political strategic decision in Beijing. It would take a few years, at least a decade, for this whole system of air defense, air force, and missiles to come together. It would require a massive Iranian effort that, based on current Iranian financial conditions, would be difficult to pull off, but who knows? On the maritime picture, I agree that navies in the region are undercapitalized. I think that there is, and that's what our study suggests, that there is less attention to that specific branch of the armed forces compared to others. And I think that there's historical reasons for that. There's issues of, within the militaries and so on in terms of procurement budgets and things. However, in doing the research, we were quite struck at one case study, which will be featured in the final paper, which is Egypt, which almost double the size of its navy in less than 10 years, essentially. From 2014 on, Egypt, while on foreign policy it wasn't very active, trying to recover from the turmoil of previous years, on the defense side, did invest quite significantly. And just looking at numbers, it added 4 submarines, 5 frigates, 1 corvette, 2 amphibious ships. And that's at a time, if you look at Egypt's threat perceptions and immediate environment, greater competition and attention in the Red Sea. They built a second canal, finding gas fields in the Eastern Mediterranean, competition in the Eastern Mediterranean, interest in the nuclear civil program, the war in Libya. So you have, and obviously the Nile River crisis and so on. So suddenly Egypt had a geopolitical rationale, and what we see is quite significant, almost a doubling. They moved from 14 of those assets to 26 in 7 years. So that perhaps is an indication of things to go, but it's really the Gulf states, and especially Saudi, with such an exposure on important waterways that will be watched very, very closely.
Superb. Thank you very much. Well, let me just say 3 things by way of conclusion of this first plenary. First, that in a moment I'll ask you all to thank Fenella McGurty and Emil Hilkayem for their presentations and also for the research that other members of staff have generated. Second, to remind everybody that we reconvene in 29 minutes for our second plenary, where we will have 4 government speakers give their government's perspectives on this. And I'd also like to conclude this session by recognizing in the hall His Royal Highness Prince Turki Al Faisal. 21 years ago, you and I discussed the IISS doing more work in the Middle East. It's been great that we've been able to launch and sustain the IISS Manama Dialogue in the Kingdom of Bahrain. We're really pleased to be here in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Thank you for your hospitality, and thank you for your patience. We have coffee and tea outside. We reconvene in 28 minutes. Thank you very much. Your Royal Highness, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted shortly to open the second and concluding plenary session of today's first IISS Riyadh Defense Forum. As you settle in your seats, might I remind you all that if any of you wish to make a crisp comment or ask a perceptive question following the presentations from this plenary, that you need to put your badge inside the side of the microphone, press the mic button as if you were to speak. The microphone will indeed turn green, but that only means that I have you on my list here and I can then call on you at the right time. If you anticipate the need to ask a question, it's better strategically to be prepared and to engage in that operation during the course of the plenary of placing your badge in the side of the microphone, pressing the button, and waiting till I call you. The second plenary session is entitled International Defense Perspectives, and we're delighted that the defense perspectives presented here will be entirely international. We are honored to have here our host, Ahmed Al-Ohali, the head of the General Authority for Military Industry here in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, Minister Kang Yoon-ho, Minister of Defense Acquisition in the Defense Ministry of the Republic of Korea, Lord Grimston, Minister of State for Investment in the United Kingdom, and Jed Royal, the Deputy Director of the Defense Security Cooperation Agency in the United States. I'll ask each of them to speak in the order in which I have just succinctly introduced them. They will speak for 6 to 8 minutes from the podium, and then we will enter the Q&A period. So with that, might I invite His Excellency Ahmed Al-Ohali of the General Authority for Military Industries here in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Thank you, sir.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. صاحب السمو الملكي الأمير تركي الفيصل حفظه الله، شرفتنا وكرمتنا بحضورك صاحب السمو، أصحاب السمو والمعالي والسعادة. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, fellow panelists, let me begin first by thanking IISS for organizing such an outstanding event today. It's the first time in Saudi Arabia, and it's an honor for me to stand here today and address the elite of the global defense industry. As you know, the world we live in today is very different from the world we lived in 3 years ago. The past few years have shown us that all around the world, cooperation is vital and needed more than ever in the face of adversity. Defense is not just simply about protecting a nation's borders, but about protecting its integrity and its infrastructure so that people can access the goods and services that keep them safe. It's about protecting digital mechanisms so that we can function and communicate. Defense is also about developing the human capital and providing people with the knowledge to innovate and lead. More importantly, collective security is about ensuring a safe, secure, and prosperous future for our children. Countries around the world are developing industrial policies to create strong and resilient national supply chains, and the Middle East is no different. In Saudi Arabia, for example, we are aiming to localize more than 50% of our military spending by 2030. His Royal Highness Prince Mohammed bin Salman made it very clear that there is no armament deal without local content. With a GDP of around $850 billion, the kingdom's economy is one of the 20 biggest in the world, opening itself to global investor and strategic partnerships. Going beyond the size of the market, nearly 50% of the kingdom's population is under 30 years of age. That means dynamism, potential, and innovation. With a clear strategy provided by Vision 2030, sitting at the heart of the Arab and Muslim worlds, and as a hub connecting 3 continents, Saudi Arabia is an investment powerhouse representing stability and prosperity. Similar initiatives are taking place in several regional countries. Our collaboration and cooperation is an ingredient for joint success. We are here in Saudi Arabia working very closely with all our partners in Saudi Arabia, with the governments, entities, as well as with the private sectors and globally, in developing and implementing programs for the defense industry sector to be self-sufficient and to strengthen our local supply chains and promote transparent and secured investments. And equally important, to support development of innovators and leaders of tomorrow's defense industry. Our strategy and goals are very clear. There has been never a better time to invest in defense sector in Saudi Arabia than now. As part of our supply chain initiatives, we have already identified more than 70 investment opportunities worth tens of billions of dollars. In another groundbreaking reform, foreign companies can now own 100% of their investments in Saudi Arabia defense sector with similar incentives offered to local investors. Over the next decade, we are expecting an aggregate investment in the industry sector here north of $10 billion. Our industrial participation program, which was mentioned in the first panel, which is really a modernized and different offset program, makes sure that the strategic partnerships between domestic and international players contribute to our localization vision and strengthen the Made in Saudi brand. We have also created a dedicated military industry human capital strategy to leverage the potential of our young and dynamic population. This includes launching over 60 initiatives in collaboration with over 100 stakeholders, including universities, research institutes, and private sector partners. We are empowering our nation by offering equal opportunities to everyone. Workforce participation among women in Saudi Arabia has been steadily increasing over the past few years. It has reached 32% by the end of 2021. That is double what it was 5 years ago. Our Women in Defense show, or our Women in Defense initiative during the WDS show, ensures women are not only represented equally in the industry, but also have access to training and development opportunities. Starting from the university, we are pursuing programs that will increase the attractiveness of the defense sector for female students and will offer them desirable career opportunities in the industry. The Kingdom focus on research and technology will help enabling successful and sustainable industrial base. There is a strong correlation, as you know, globally between defense R&D spending and successful and sustainable industrial localization. Currently, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia expenditure on R&D as a percentage of its total defense procurement budget is less than 1%. And we hear that from Fenella today on the comparison to other industrialized regions. When compared to the global average, which is the percent of about 4.3%, and also or compared to the most advanced in research and development like US and China, which is about 8.3%, our aspirations in R&D in Saudi Arabia is to increase our investment fourfold by the year 2030. Our strategy has identified several categories of priority technologies, and with the newly established General Authority for Defense Development, both GAMI and the newly established authority, we will work together to ensure the success of creating a sound innovation, research ecosystem, and deliver for the main localization target. All of these programs, reforms, and initiatives are catalysts for the transformation our country is witnessing. This is an unprecedented period for strategic partnerships, investments, and a chance to be part of history in the making. I look forward to having this discussion with such distinguished guests about how defense enables a safe and prosperous world for all. And I look forward to have a successful second panel. Thank you very much.
Your Excellency, thank you very much. Minister Kang of the Republic of Korea.
Good afternoon, everyone. I think first plenary session is very, very wonderful and fruitful. But generally speaking, I think basically second plenary session is a little boring, especially considering my voice and my message are too much boring. So before starting my speech, I should make you wake up. So recently I read a very interesting report about healthcare. 20-second hand clapping is very, very good to your health. How about following me with hand clapping? Not foot clapping, with hand clapping, like this. Let's start with just only 20-second hand clapping. Let's start. Thank you very much for your big applause for my speech. Distinguished guests, I'm Kang Hoon-ho, the Minister of DAPA of Korea. DAPA is the specialized governmental ministry for defense acquisition in Korea. It was launched in 2006, and I'm one of the initial members of DAPA. Since my inauguration as the Minister of DAPA in December 2020, my priority has been the development of defense acquisition program and the defense industry of Korea. Before beginning my speech, I would like to give my word of congratulations for the success of WDS. And I would like to confer my heartfelt appreciation to His Royal Highness Salman bin Abdulaziz Al Saud and His Royal Highness Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman Al Saud for inviting me to this meaningful event. Also, my special thanks must go out to the Governor of GAMI, His Excellency Ahmed Abdulaziz Mohammed Al Ohali, for your endeavors in hosting this event. And I would like to express my deepest gratitude to Dr. John Chipman of IISS for organizing this event and giving me such an honored opportunity to deliver my speech. The Korean War in 1950 brought the entire land into the ashes of war. That time, Korea could not afford to produce even a small gun or bomb without any available infrastructure nor technology. However, the majority of weapon systems for the Army, Navy, and Air Force is now homegrown, which is a tremendous source of pride as the Minister of DAPA. My speech contains 3 parts today. First is the lessons we learned from the growth of Korean defense industry. Second is the direction of Korean defense industry in the coming years. And the last is our approach in international defense industry cooperation. There are many factors behind this remarkable growth of our defense industry and technology, but I'd like to highlight the two parts. First is the establishment of Defense R&D Center, ADD, the Agency for Defense Development. And the second is the founding of Defense Acquisition Program Administration, DARPA, which is the specialized government ministry for defense acquisition. ADD was established in 1970 with the mission of independent development of weapon system in Korea. There had been some skepticism behind on the feasibility of independent development, and some criticized that it is more cost-effective to acquire systems from abroad. Notwithstanding, the technology prowess has been accumulated with the development of basic weapons such as small arms as starting point. And ADD has been always at the center of a majority of Korean weapon systems. Today, the development of weapon system is conducted by defense company in Korea, and ADD is now focusing on the development of advanced future technology. I strongly believe that ADD will continue to be at the center of the development of defense technology in Korea. Another driving force behind our growth is the establishment of DARPA, which was founded in 2006 as the specialized government ministry for defense acquisition program. In the wake of its exemption, the formulation of defense acquisition and defense R&D policy, allocation of defense acquisition program, promotion of defense industry, as well as comprehensive management of defense projects were made possible, creating synergy effect. During early days of DARPA, there has been some concerns and criticisms over the concentration of excessive power and poor communication with military forces. Before its establishment, defense acquisition work was dispersed to 8 institutions, such as the Ministry of National Defense, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and Army, Navy, Air Force. However, as DARPA integrates once dispersed work, efficiency, transparency, and specialty has remarkably improved. Since its beginning in 2006 to 2020, defense R&D budget has surged from $1.1 billion to $2.6 billion, and sales in defense industry has grown from $4.6 billion to $12.1 billion, recording triple growth. DARPA is committed to expediting changes for the whole new defense industry. We are determined to become first mover with developing our new weapon systems using our own technology rather than being the fast follower. For this, the new department will be newly set up in DARPA to focus on the development of advanced technology, and by doing so, 20% of DARPA's capacity will be dedicated for the development of new technology in preparation for the future, taking on bold challenges. Furthermore, DARPA will expedite the promotion of defense companies to dive into new areas such as space, AI, drone, semiconductor, and robot. Korea has improved the level of defense technology and the defense industry capability through the government-led defense R&D and localization. However, defense weapon systems are becoming more complicated, and the time and cost of development are increasing as well. This makes it more difficult for one country to cover all areas on its own. As a result, Korea seeks to go beyond the strategy of independent development and domestic production to create international defense cooperation, where both parties can achieve the win-win relations via co-development and local production. You would like to identify common requirements in weapon systems and conduct co-R&D with defense partner country. We will support local production through nurturing local contractors and the technology transfer in production. In addition, by sharing equipment and parts with a partner country, we will facilitate mutual logistics supporting systems and post-production development. And performance improvement will be also conducted as well. In particular, we pin high hope that Saudi Arabia and many countries in the Middle East can be the major defense cooperation partners. And we wish to build defense cooperation partnership, which can reduce the cost of development, production, operation, and maintenance through building the defense cooperation system. Last but not least, this kind of international cooperation process will strictly abide by international export control system. Korea is one of the 4 Asian countries which joined the 4 major international export control systems. Once again, I would like to highlight that Korea will provide our utmost effort to keep international peace, and will pursue international cooperation abiding these kind of international rules. Let me draw the conclusion of my presentation. As I already mentioned, Korea has built strong military power and nurtured the defense industry to protect our own country in the face of a real threat from North Korea. However, Korea is not the country that seeks regional dominance, and we are the peace-loving country with no major enemy except North Korea. Therefore, we always wish to have more friends, and I hope to make strategic cooperative relations that mutually create win-win partnership. There is a saying, if we want to go fast, go alone. But if we want to go far, go together. I wish to have more partners which can enable us to go farther away in the defense industry cooperation. This concludes my presentation. Thank you very much. Shukran.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Minister Kang, for underlining your interest in emerging defense technology, especially in the AI and space domains that, of course, are of great interest also in this region. With all the concentration going on about the European security situation, perhaps it's just worth noting that yesterday the DPRK launched its 9th ballistic missile test of the year, so we need to be alert to those realities too. With that, could I invite Lord Grimston to give the perspective from the United Kingdom? Thank you.
Well, Your Royal Highness, Your Excellencies, fellow ministers, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, thank you very much, John, and for all those at IISS for inviting me to speak today, and in particular for sharing your extraordinarily valuable insights into the region's economic and defence priorities. They have given us all much to think about. And it's fantastic to be back in the Kingdom, my 5th visit in just over 12 months, and to be representing the UK at the World Defence Show. Saudi Arabia, and indeed the whole region, is especially important to myself and to my country because of our historic and everlasting ties. And the UK is excited and optimistic about our evolving relationship with the region. And building this ever closer partnership is one of our absolute priorities. Our Prime Minister has made it very clear to all his ministers that this is one of our top priorities. And of course, it goes without saying that defence is a key tenet of our relationships. And in the years ahead, identifying new opportunities to partner in this sector will continue to be vital. As the IISS findings clearly show, the region's ambitions for the future match our own. And the UK is already responding to this signal as we seek out opportunities for collaboration. And for the industrial aspect of our defence relationship, these will include not just sharing intellectual property, but jointly creating it. And this will come from co-investing in research and development and through stimulating two-way investment. And my fervent belief that investment can no longer be a one-way street, a one-way traffic. It is the mutuality of investment where both parties benefit and deepen and enrich their collaboration through it is the future of investment. Now, the Industrial Cooperation Committee that I have the pleasure of jointly chairing with His Excellency the Governor of GAMI is an excellent example of the defence partnerships we are building. And our work is already bearing fruit. And this week we expect good news on several joint ventures and partnership agreements. But as the IISS findings show, due to the live physical threat, the very real physical threat that state and non-state actors pose across this region when compared to the UK and other economies, completely understandable and appropriate that countries here allocate a significantly higher proportion of their budgets to defence. And I can't see this ceasing in the near future. And there is a shared desire to direct spending towards investment as well as research and development. And that, of course, is going to be crucial to developing the region's domestic industrial bases. This is so important, and bolstering security. And I very much support this. And the UK stands ready to work with the Kingdom, and indeed the whole of the region, to identify and seize opportunities for investment to support these aims. And picking up the words of my co-chairman earlier, particularly in human capital and through training and education. Because these investments can form the basis of a resilient and enduring sovereign capability and will be especially important as our economies continue to recover from the pandemic and face the growing geopolitical challenges that we are all facing. But I stand here speaking to you all while our friends and our partners face regional challenges that absolutely certainly have global ramifications. And this strengthens the case for closer cooperation in defence and security and across our relationships. And of course, there will be times when challenges with the relationships will evolve, but I'm confident that this transition will pay dividends for us all. and that structures like the Industrial Cooperation Committee, to my mind, a model for cooperation, will mobilize industry to lower barriers to cooperation. Building a solid foundation upon which we can integrate our partnerships, develop our capabilities jointly, and of course, export together. And in these uncertain and trying times for the international community, as Russia wages a reckless and illegal war in Ukraine, partnerships in defense between the UK and our allies and partners around the world become ever more important, because they will protect our people at home and abroad, our economic security, our infrastructure, and critically, our ways of life, allowing us to protect our shared vision for a global order and counter threats to our shared interests. And of course, through that, promoting mutual prosperity, industry, and innovation. But it is not only our partnerships in defense that will enable us to hold firm. Our economic partnerships are also key to the stability of our regions. We trade and invest together in so many areas, and this makes, of course, our supply chains strong and resilient to economic shocks like the one sparked by President Putin's invasion of Ukraine. And as Europe rightly reduces its dependence on Russian gas, on Russian hydrocarbons, with Nord Stream 2 now cancelled, reliable partners are needed more than ever. So in closing, I want to make one thing crystal clear. The UK is committed to working with our friends across the Middle East and North Africa to bolster our mutual defence capabilities, to strengthen all our economies, and most importantly, to prepare for the future. Thank you all very much.
Lord Grimston, thank you so much for that very strong statement underlying the shared desire to direct spending towards investment in R&D, and that investment must, of course, crucially include human capital. Jed Worrell, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And two quick comments off the top. First, thank you to IISS for convening these kinds of forum, which are so important to the contemporary discussion and discourse on such important issues. And those presentations we received earlier during the first plenary were absolutely exceptional. So thank you very much for the investment IISS is making here in this region, in London, in Washington, and around the world. Secondly, Governor, I'm going to go ahead and congratulate you on what will be a tremendous WDS. That might be bad luck. I don't believe in luck. And so I predict a tremendous success for you in this inaugural event. And thank you to you and to all of our hosts here in the Kingdom for bringing us together. I want to touch today on several trends in impacting defense industry going forward and bring some connection to my work, which is in the world of security cooperation, how we connect with our allies and partners around the world to create capability and capacity for our mutual security interests. And I've got 7, so that's a bit long. I'll hustle through them as fast as I can. The first trend I want to note is a sobering one. As we sit here in this room, there are Russian cruise missiles and artillery shells landing across the nation of Ukraine, and that is a moment worth reflecting on. This will undoubtedly change the nature of the defense industry over the coming 5 to 10 years. For those of us who thought that we had gotten past naked military aggression in our history, we are brought back to reality very quickly in the last week or so. My agency is central right now to the response to this crisis in Ukraine, participating directly in providing lethal and non-lethal equipment to our Ukrainian friends. Internally in my agency, we've now stood up what we call the European Crisis Management Team. And this team is focused simply on trying to process and prioritize the variety of requests that are coming in from our NATO and European partners, just as they flood us with requests for prioritization, for new equipment, and for processing of existing requests for sales. So this will undoubtedly change the nature of our cooperation, both with industry and with our partners going forward. Secondly, emerging and disruptive technology. We've touched on this a little bit already today, and my thanks to Minister Kang for his emphasis on this topic. My view is that these technologies are actually outpacing our government's and global government's approach to be able to harness them. In the Department of Defense, we've stood up a joint artificial intelligence center that's focused on trying to understand how to apply artificial intelligence into our industrial requirements. We have the Defense Innovation Unit that is co-located with Silicon Valley and with tech companies to make discerning decisions on how to apply new emerging technologies for our department. Of course, we have DARPA, well known. My last 4 years I spent at NATO. One of the projects I was able to work on was development of a brand new framework for emerging disruptive technologies for the Alliance, and how to look and scan the horizon across all 30 allies to determine where that technology was emanating and how we could make best use of it, and develop frameworks, policy, procedural frameworks around it so that it did not pass us by too quickly. But nonetheless, we're still struggling to keep up with the pace of this technological development. I think this is going to drive a new conversation on government sovereignty in some respects, when you have technology firms that are able to keep pace and keep footing with what were otherwise previously the domains of governments only. I think it will also necessarily, if we're smart, will drive a new public and private conversation on how we participate with one another. That will require a great deal of trust. It will require familiarity and understanding of the rules of the road, of how these technologies might impact our security situation and our industries. And I caution in this case that there may be some tension here that we need to watch out for between corporate profit motives versus the government national security motive of security and stability. But nonetheless, I predict that if we are opening this conversation effectively and really engaging with good faith, then we will find a way forward, but we need to move very quickly. Third, I believe we need to start to reconsider the profitability model for defense exports. For industry, what does this mean? In the first case, probably means a broader investment in exportability early on in the research and development phase. Right now, we often, in the United States, have our primary industry partners looking at the United States services, the military, as their primary customer, and so investing a lot of time in trying to make sure they're meeting the US service requirements, and then only after the fact, sometime later, considering the application of exportable variants of those systems. I think that we need to be thinking about this much earlier in the R&D phase and not waiting until we're into the test and evaluation phase. I'll give you one interesting example. I was speaking with a colleague over breakfast about how challenging the policy decision was in the early 2000s to sell F-16s to Chile, whereas fast forward 20 years, we now have a plant in Greenville, South Carolina, my home state, building F-16s exclusively for export. We do not, in the United States, acquire F-16s anymore, but we do build them and sell them exclusively for export. And we need to be thinking that far ahead when we think about technology research and development right now, and making sure that we're not waiting too long before we think about partnership with our allies and partners and the exportability of those systems. There will be a new emphasis in the National Defense Strategy when it is promulgated here in the coming months on the importance of relying on allies and partners and new levels of reliability. And if that's the case, if we, the United States, make a determination that our national security will be increasingly reliant on the capability and capacity of our allies and partners, we need to invest in that early, and industry is a critical participant in that process. For government, this means greater anticipatory policies, making sure that we're conveying to industry early the importance of which policies are important to us, and making smart bets with limited government resources in areas that we know will be increasingly important for collective security interests. It's difficult right now. There is so much information on new technologies out there. It can be very difficult to scan and understand all of the different applications, but we need to do a good job of making sure that we're investing in those relationships, both with traditional and with non-traditional defense industry partners. Fourth, I think we also might need to reconsider the engagement and the access model for allies and partners to U.S. defense industry. For government, I think this means that we need to stop being quite as passive as we have been in the past. In this case, what I mean is that we've often waited for a demand signal from an ally or partner before we begin a conversation on capability requirements. In the future, I think we need to be driving an alignment conversation early. So it's demand-driven, but it's also interest-driven, where we are able to collect up our mutual thoughts and make sure that we're investing together in the right capabilities and with the right capacity. Again, I think that the relationship, the emphasis on allies and partners in the new National Defense Strategy will very much illuminate some of that for us. I mentioned I was at NATO the last 4 years. At NATO, we have the NATO defense planning process. It's not perfect, and I wouldn't recommend that NATO become a model for others. Each region is unique and specific in its own regard. But having said that, this model now has 30 nations working together to agree on the collective security requirements of the entire alliance by serial line, every single capability with volumes attached to it. And there's something to say for us being able to make sure we have that conversation early on with our allies and partners. The other element of this is making sure that allies have the right kind of access to U.S. defense industry. And I'm afraid that we've been a little bit too restrictive in thinking about the financing model for for allies and partners as they look to acquire U.S. product. We need to be a little bit more competitive in that with things like distributed payment schedules and possibly low-risk loans in the future. Fenella, I think, made an interesting point on where the U.S. is not able or unwilling to offer a certain product, then we see China in some cases stepping into that. I actually don't see this to be a very concerning situation with respect to the capability itself. I think, though, the more concerning question is whether or not the U.S. financing approach, our model, can compete with the Chinese financing model. And that is the significant difference between those two models right now. Fifth, we see increasing demand from our allies and partners on non-standard equipment. I think the United States needs to increasingly prioritize what we call non-program of record, that is non-standard equipment requirements from our allies and partners. This is going to be increasingly significant as every relationship is unique and requires tailoring in its own regard. Right now, if the United States is buying something for our own inventory, there's a natural momentum there that rises it to the top of the inbox. I think in the future, we'll need to make sure that we are equally pressing forward on those non-program requirements, again, because of the broadening reliance on allies and partners in the future. Six, we need to start avoiding duplication and political obstacles to industrial cooperation. Again, the NATO example, I think, is relevant here, where we have one single transatlantic alliance, but multiple transatlantic industries, or I should say non-transatlantic industries, that are prevented from effective cooperation in some cases by virtue of the fact that there are onerous political obstacles to that industrial cooperation. I think it's worth saying here, from our perspective in the United States, the sale of a piece of equipment is not the end game. We see a conversation that starts with requirements, that moves to interoperability, to absorption, to training and equipping, and then to political will and a long-term durable relationship. That is the end game. And the reason that my agency has existed now for 50 years is because we want to build a durable relationship at the end of the day. Seventh, industrial base viability. And here COVID has laid bare what we perhaps thought previously were higher levels of resilience in our industrial base. The world will remain a highly competitive place. I think government and industry need to spend more time talking to each other about how to build in new levels of resilience when this situation won't be going away anytime soon. I'll wrap with two very quick comments. I mentioned our new national defense strategy with its enhanced emphasis on allies and partners. That line of effort in the NDS will become real with reliable, ready, and operational capabilities and capacity across all regions, and in particular in this region. While not all regions will experience the same pressures, the relationships that hold them together will be the factor that makes a difference at the end of the day. I think that we will see coming out of the NDS increasing emphasis on a difference between frontline states that are dealing with key pressures from those that wish to change the rules-based international order, and then the importance and value of investing in regional security anchors in other regions where stability and crisis management might be the most important requirements going forward. So I would say that we need to be more discreet in the way that we think about our relationships with both sets of partners and allies. Finally, on my agency, the Defense Security Cooperation Agency, I just wanted to note that we are an all-of-NDS agency. Many folks think of us as the people who sell weapons, and we only service that part of the national defense strategy. But our national defense strategy will have quite a lot to say on international humanitarian law, on values, on human rights, and my agency will be an agency that services those interests as well. We have one of our components at my agency is the Defense Institute for International Legal Studies, with a large group of attorneys all trained in IHL that look to advise and support the capability development process with our allies and partners to make sure that we're thinking about, for example, advanced targeting practices and civilian casualty mitigation. And we need to be thinking just as effectively about that part of our security cooperation relationships as we are about the weapons sales side. We'll also be spending a lot of time working with our sister agencies in the US government on technology security. I just came from Abu Dhabi, where our Emirati partners hosted a fantastic conference on technological security. The word is getting out that this is a critical piece of making sure that we maintain the edge into the future. Thank you very much for your attention.
Jed, thank you very much for that group of 7 points. Of all of them, I might just underscore the second, which is maybe of particular interest to many here, that the development of new technologies is outpacing the capacity of governments to procure and absorb them, both into inventories and into operations. We're now going to open it, as we did after the first plenary, to the floor. I've got 6 or 7 people on my list, and I'll come back to the panel to roughly in reverse order in which they spoke, to take the questions principally addressed to them. First was Simone Soare from Romania.
Thank you so much. My question is first to Governor Alohali. And I was wondering if you could give us a little bit more of detail about Saudi vision as to how you are seeking to adapt the way that your procurement and acquisition systems are going to deal with emerging and disruptive technologies as you are seeking to integrate them into defense capabilities. And then if I may, also a question for Lord Grimston and Deputy Director Royal. I'm happy that you mentioned values and norms, because that was sort of one of the questions that I was going to raise here as to whether within our partnerships with countries in the Middle East, we are thinking of highlighting best practices with respect to the use of new emerging technologies. If you could comment a little bit on that, I'd be very grateful. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Turki bin Bandar bin Abdulaziz Al Saud from Saudi Arabia.
Good afternoon, everyone. My question is directed to His Excellency Lord Grimston and also to Mr. Royal. And I hope we don't hear a diplomatic answer. My question is, don't you think releasability of military technology and capabilities will affect building national capabilities and two-way investments? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And from the UK, Wayne Keeble.
Thank you very much. And I have two questions, if I may, please. One to the Deputy Director relating to technology transfer. One of the issues that we see sometimes holding us back is the concern over transfer of IP and the subsequent elements of discrete technology transfer, where we would like to be able to do more business and partner, but sometimes we're held back. So I'd like his view on that, please, if he may. And perhaps the world events have loosened the strings there a little. And for Lord Grimston, I wonder if you would comment on the collaboration between large organizations, perhaps when it comes to working in region, and whether your organization could help broker those collaborations where perhaps we've been stovepipe before and we might be more effective if we were collective in our endeavors. Thank you.
Thank you. And also from the UK, Caroline Emmett.
My question is to the esteemed Minister from the Republic of Korea. Your nation's climate strategy pledges a reduction of greenhouse gas emissions by 40% by 2039. What opportunities is this providing for your defence acquisition programme and for your future plans in terms of emerging technology and capabilities? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And since she worked so hard this morning, I think Fenella Magati can now pose challenge to the panel. Fenella.
Thank you, John. So my first question is for Lord Grimstone. In terms of the industrial cooperation agreements and partnerships in the region, are there any, will this be broad spectrum or will it be on targeted capabilities? Are there any that the UK perhaps would avoid if other market entrants have a more of a prior market share? Equally, are there opportunities that the UK is going to pursue specifically? And a second question, if I may, for Deputy Director Royal. It's quite a technical question in terms of how would the financing model becoming more competitive, how would that work? What support do we think there is for that back in the US? And are there any risks to extending that kind of policy towards certain countries, especially as economies are facing difficulties and inflation's rising, so you have to build that into contracts? Thanks.
Thank you so much. And Doug Barry.
Thanks, John. It's a theme that's been touched on in a few of the questions and indeed in a few of the presentations, so it's really a general question for the panel. But it's around this tension between what the purchaser may want or indeed desires to get in terms of technology access to build up their own defence industrial base, and the challenge for the seller or the provider of, at the same time as servicing that requirement, protecting key national technologies, be it intellectual property rights or sensitive classified materials. Thank you.
Thank you. Hassan Al-Hassan.
Thank you, John. My question is addressed to His Excellency Governor Al-Ohali. Your Excellency, you mentioned the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia's ambitious goals in the area of defense indigenization and local industrial development. As we've heard in the previous session from Fenella and Emil, not all of Saudi Arabia's defense partners are equally prepared to transfer technology to the kingdom. Should we expect Saudi Arabia to give greater priority to defense partners who are more willing to transfer technology and contribute to the kingdom's defense indigenization agenda? Thank you.
Thanks. And I'll take three more before reverting to the panel for their responses and remarks. Bastian Giegerick.
John, thank you very much. Two quick questions, if I may. The first one to His Excellency, Governor O'Hally. So you spoke about the importance of raising R&D spending, but also defining priorities in order to deliver on your localization targets. So that is from your side. What are the one or two most important things that your industry partners should do to support that agenda that you've outlined? And my second question is to Jed Royal. You mentioned with regards to a Chinese presence in the market, you're less concerned about the capability and more concerned about competitiveness and when it comes to financing models and so on. But it seems to me that the presence of certain Chinese systems is already complicating the export of American and other systems, because it suggests something about the nature of the relationship, of course. And I'd like to invite you to comment on that a little bit more. Thank you.
James Hackett.
Thanks, John. Question to Minister Kang. Building on your the reference to DARPA's new technology priorities, I wonder if you could say a little bit about how DARPA has looked to the degree to which it's looking to build developments with the private sector and learn from and take advantage of technology developments in the private sector. And to Jed Royal, you mentioned Silicon Valley. As we know, the relationship between the Defense Department and Silicon Valley hasn't always been smooth of late. How, in your view, do you think the US government is looking to, and how much progress has it made in alleviating concerns in the private sector, high-tech community about working with DoD? Thank you.
And finally, Tom Beckett.
Minister Kang, you explained very nicely how Korea had developed from no defense base through until a sophisticated defense industry, including significant exports, most recently, I think, artillery to Australia. You said that you were keen to engage in co-development and local production, yet you would be cognizant of export controls. So my question is sort of the flip side of Hassan al-Hassan's, is what can you offer to countries that want greater support for R&D and IP cooperation and so on, that the more established and traditional weapons suppliers for the region, represented by Lord Grimston and Jed Royal, can't do?
Thank you very much. So there's quite an agenda there. Not everybody has to answer every question, but try your best to answer at least those questions directed towards you. Maybe I would ask first, Jed Royal, you had 3 or 4 focused on you.
Sure, certainly. Thank you very much for those questions. Deeply insightful just in listening to them. On values and norms, and particularly with respect to emerging disruptive technologies, there is a very active conversation going on right now on this particular topic. First is on, in its initial phase, data management policy. How do we have a data policy that respects the rights of human beings, of citizens, of nations, while we are also looking to use that data in order to be able to make each of these technologies effective? I think to the extent that we answer that question on how we handle data and what our policy is for data, then we will find that the application with a number of these technologies becomes a little bit more understandable and computable for us going forward. But having said that, we need to make sure that what we're not talking about in the US system, at least, is killer robots that are fully autonomous and do not have a human in the loop. And so to the extent that that is not well understood, I want to be clear on that point, that we are very much interested in making sure that human judgment is very much a part of our development of these technologies. And again, data is really the beginning part of that conversation. Let's see here. Wayne asked a question on technology transfer and intellectual property. Again, I referred to anticipatory policies in the United States and the need to be able to advance the way that we think about this as the research and development process is moving forward. In some cases, we don't know the nature of that technology at the outset of the research and development process. And so sometimes takes a bit of time for us to be able to make that determination But to the extent that we can anticipate with broad parameters for how we think about transferring technology to partners, we need to be able to do that. Perhaps it's a bit of good news. The Secretary of Defense announced just a couple of weeks ago the sale of 250 M1A2 SEP V3 Abrams tanks to Poland. And it's the first time that we have exported that variant of tank. And so I do think that there is a new conversation that's brewing in the United States about making sure that as we continue to rely on allies and partners in new and novel ways, that we are ensuring that they are capable in that regard. Let's see, Fenella asked about a technical question on competitive financing models. I'm not a technical guy, so I won't go too far down the technical road. But I will say that we've already taken some interesting steps in the United States, things such as risk-assessed payment schedules. This is understanding the creditworthiness of our allies and partners and adjusting payment schedules associated with that risk as we understand it. Looking at some interesting and creative approaches with termination liability. That's basically upfront insurance on weapon sales. And we have other categories of opportunity that we're providing our partners. I think in the future, one of the models we really do need to be looking at is loans. This is an active conversation within the interagency right now. We are not currently providing government-backed guaranteed loans for defense exports. And that's one thing that I do think we need to look towards in the future. But there's other models out there that I think we can explore. Bastian asked on financing and presence of China. Does China complicate U.S. capabilities? The answer is yes, it does. I don't want to diminish the fact that China is playing a certain game with its defense exports and with its facilities that does in fact complicate the way that the United States thinks about partnerships with our allies and our partners. Having said that, I won't get into many details here, but I'll just say that it's worth our nations continuing to talk honestly and openly about the impacts associated with that so that we can find ways around them should they present real problems for us. I think I've probably answered more than I should have. I'll stop there. Thanks, John.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Lord Grimston.
Well, yes, thank you very much. I intend to answer less than I should have, having been answered so many questions, sort of following Jed. But let me make some general comments. Look, first of all, why are we allies and partners? It's because we do share values and norms. And because we share values and norms, it allows us to discuss them. It allows us to get into sensitive areas, which of course includes how we should monitor, emerging technologies and when they're used in the region. Doesn't mean that we should not use these technologies, but it means that we should be able to discuss them and to make sure that their use does line up with our norms. On collaboration, I'm very much in favour, except for certain very specialised national security matters, that if you collaborate, you have to collaborate across a broad spectrum. If you start picking and choosing what you're collaborating on, it isn't collaboration, and it's not a true partnership. So I am brave and I am sort of forward-leaning on this. This part about how do we work together with large organisations, small businesses. I run the Office for Investment for our Prime Minister in 10 Downing Street. And the whole purpose of that office, and we've developed some very far-reaching investment partnerships with countries in the Gulf, is to help partners talk to each other. It's to help big companies understand what's going on here and vice versa. And frankly, to open up people in this region to our policymakers at an early stage so that our policymaking can be influenced. There's no point sitting in an ivory cage, developing technologies, developing capabilities, and then hoping that your partners are going to want to use them. I'm a great believer in collaboration in these matters from an early stage.
Thank you very much. I actually might press, just before I move to Minister Kang, press either of you to answer the sort of question about government collaboration with the high-tech world. Last November, Richard Moore, the head of the Secret Intelligence Service, gave his first public speech at the IISS, where he said his organization was now beginning to work with all sorts of people in the private sector, including rather small startups, on how to incorporate new technologies. Do you, Lord Grimston, feel that that's a happy and congenial relationship in the UK with technology startups, or do you worry about the sorts of big problems that the United States has had with their high technology giants?
Look, I'm not worried at all. And one of the things the UK has is a whole variety of startups. I can always tell who they are because they're about a quarter of my age and don't wear ties. But the ideas that come out of that absolutely has to form part of our philosophy and our work going forward. And this one has to, we have to use their language, we have to deal with them. That is not just the future, it is the present as well.
Minister Kang.
To convey my answer clearly, I will speak in Korean. Please use translation here.
For me, I had 3 questions. First is about climate change. 40% of the reduction of GHG and its impact on the defense acquisition and the impact on the future plan. And I would like to give answer to that. Korean government has been implementing the various efforts to prevent climate change. In particular, in defense area, Korea has technological advantage and that should be utilized in defense area. And to do so, we have been putting best effort. And in particular, the hydrogen-powered engine has been developed and that has been mounted in weapon systems, and this kind of development has started. And also, many great technology regarding battery has been seen in the private area. And that can be also the possible area that we can dwell into. Second, about the utilization of the private technology, such as Silicon Valley, and the utilization of technology that are being in the U.S. And you asked about this question. And in 2017, I went to the Silicon Valley. There has been GIS committee, and I've seen how these technologies are utilized on the defense area. So in various areas, Korea has been putting best effort to utilize this kind of private technology. And to utilize this kind of technology, DIU is the Defense Innovation Group, and this is established to utilize this technology. Basically, we are focusing on utilizing the homegrown technology. However, we are expecting to utilize also the technology from other countries as well. Third, there are various experts about the weapon systems. And under the international control system, we have been expanding our cooperation. And regarding this cooperation, you asked me what kind of plan we have and what kind of plan we have for IP. Basically, when we cooperate our friendly countries, as aforementioned, I already mentioned in my presentation that we pursue win-win relations. This is our priority, which means that not only limit to the relations of buyer and seller, but we would like to utilize the advantage of the partner countries. In the relations with cooperation, if we can also conduct co-R&D, if we have the background IP in Korea, maybe there can be some limitations. However, we can share foreground IP. And regarding the various weapon systems, localization can be also proactively supported. We are ready for that. In the short term, we hope that
무기체계 운영과 관련된
regarding the operation of weapon systems, we can support the sustainable maintenance capacity.
Minister Kang, thank you very much. Governor.
Thanks, John. I think I had 4 questions, and I probably lumped them in 2 because they have some, I would say, similarities. The first one was talking about how to adapt acquisition and procurement program versus emerging technologies, particularly in procurement. And I will probably address them in a couple angles. One is through very solid acquisition and procurement protocol by the forces and the end users. And the second one is through innovation, research, and technology. But before that, I think both these 2 anchors require a real important umbrella. And that umbrella is a trust and relationship. I think Saudi Arabia share a lot of values in terms of national security with lots of our friends and partners throughout the globe. Saudi Arabia has proven that it's a very trusted, player in the world. For example, in the energy, in terms of stability through the globe. So expanding that into acquisition versus emerging technologies, I think our forces and I would call them the end users, they go through that process of evaluation of requirements versus emerging technologies. Now, this is, to me, is the first step. What's the more important, more sustainable, is what we just talked about. Minister Kang and Lord Grimston talk about the emerging technologies. Without research and technology and innovation and a sustainable program, I think you will be left behind, no matter how much help you will have from other nations or other partners. And this is what we are mostly talking about, is in collaboration through the industrial participation program, through the friendly companies and countries that will help us to work through the acquisition program and the emerging technologies. The second question was talking about technology transfer partners, and I think it was their willingness to help in the transfer of technology and what are the key things for the industries. Well, I will just want to make a statement that, and I mentioned it in my initial keynote, that research and development is one of the key pillars for Saudi Arabia to develop its defense industry. And we are making a real big deal out of it and commitments in terms of investments. And as I mentioned, our strategy and goals is to invest or spend 3 to 4 folds of what we have spending in the last couple of years. I think, again, the relationship here, in my opinion, is very important. We have established a very solid intellectual property program that will ensure the transfer of technology is well protected in the kingdom. Again, the industrial participation program, it involves incentives and it involves also leeway for the OEMs who are transfer technologies to benefit from the acquisitions program. The main 2 things I would say in terms of from the industry part is, one of them is in human capital, the second of them is the involvement in the supply chain in Saudi Arabia. I think these eventually will help support the transfer of technology. That's it.
Governor, thank you very much. In a moment, I'll ask you to, in your own words, conclude this day. For my part, let me first thank our 4 speakers here for their marvelous presentations and their stimulation of so much thought in the hall. For the IISS, it's been truly a signal honor to have been able to present our data and research here in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. The IISS is international in composition, international in perspective, and international in reach. And I have to say what a pleasure it's been for all of the IISS staff to be working here in Saudi Arabia and in partnership with the GAMI. We hope to return again. Let me thank all the 4 speakers now for their marvelous presentations and invite Governor of GAMI to give us the last word and conclude our proceedings for the day.
Thanks. Is it clear? Yeah. Thanks, Joe. First of all, I would like to thank all of you of being part of today's exciting discussions and exchange of information. I think we have been talking about a very important and critical global security issues. And we are delighted also that to have IISS to establish this first Riyadh Defense Forum on the eve of the World Defense Show, which runs tomorrow, and it's going to be from Sunday to Wednesday. It's going to have a lot of exciting events. We're going to have 600 participants, exhibitors, both government and companies from around the globe. We're going to have this coming from about 40 countries with about 60 delegations also. It's the first time, but we are very confident and sure that it's going to be a unique exhibition. Throughout the show, we're going to have two major, I would say, events that I would encourage you to participate or at least attend them. First one on Monday, we'll have two ministerial panels that will be talking on two major issues which we have discussed today. One is in innovation and technology in defense, and the other one in human capital in defense. That's going to take on Monday from 11 to 1. The second one, which are very proud also, and it will be hosted by Her Royal Highness Princess Rima bin Bandar bin Sultan, our ambassador to the US. She will be hosting the Women in Defense Day on Tuesday. There will be lots of respected CEOs, women CEOs in the defense industry. There will be a lot of discussion that I personally look forward for that. Again, we thank you very much for attending today, and I hope you will have a very lovely and exciting WDS show the next 4 days. Thank you.
Marvelous. Thank you very much, sir. Got a networking lunch reception.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you very much.